Community Broadcasting Association of Australia, and I've got Frida Lee, also from the CBAA, here with me. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We'll go up to 45 minutes. With the first 30 minutes or so, I'm just going to take you through the review and what's happening with the codes of practice, and we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. If you've got any questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A part, and Danny Chifley, who is back from long service leave this week, will be really happy to have a look at those Q&As. He might answer some, but he'll also send any that are relevant through to Frida and I to answer. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're on today for Frida and I. That's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay our respects to elders past and present. And I'd also like to honour the dedication of and expertise of First Nations media and their work to strengthen and connect communities, and the vital role that they play in truth-telling and reconciliation. As I think everyone would know, because you're hearing this webinar, the CBAA is undertaking a review of the codes of practice. This is to make sure that the codes reflect the changing media environment, community standards, and remain relevant. The codes were last updated in 2008, and a lot has changed in those 14 years. As I think many of you would know, our sector is regulated by the Broadcast Services Act, which was an act from 1992, and the Community Broadcasting Codes of Practice, which is what we're here to talk about today. The codes are made for our sector, by our sector, and go hand in hand with the Broadcast Services Act. That's why it's really important that we get your feedback through this consultation, so we can make sure that the codes are relevant and agreed to by the vast majority of the sector. As the sector organisation representing the majority of licensees, it's the CBAA's role to coordinate a periodic review. This is to make sure, as I said earlier, that the codes reflect changing community standards and remain relevant in a contemporary media environment. In getting to the point we're at, we've consulted particularly, or worked with a few of the other sector bodies to get a draft that we believe is at a point that can be tested by the broader sector. We've also worked very closely with ACMA on getting to this point, because ultimately ACMA needs to sign off on these codes once we put them forward to them. So this first draft of the codes, and it's very much a first draft, is here for you to reflect on, for you to tell us whether it works or not, to tell us where there's problems, to tell us what could be tweaked or changed. And we're very much welcoming feedback and suggestions from stations, or from individuals, peak bodies, or anyone, in fact, that has an interest. We're going out quite widely. Consumer groups, listeners, many stations are playing the codes, an announcement about this review on their stations, and we encourage stations to continue playing that until the consultation ends in a week or so's time. The Broadcast Services Act outlines the requirement for the codes and mandates that they need majority support of the sector. What's really important to note, though, is the codes and the Broadcast Services Act shouldn't duplicate. And this is one of the problems with the existing code. There's things in the codes that are also in the Broadcast Services Act, and ACMA deals with them differently. So what we've done this time, and what is one of the key changes, is anything that's in the Broadcast Services Act is not in the codes of practice. For example, the 5-minute sponsorship is not in the codes because it's a legislative requirement. So we won't be here today to talk about changing the 5 minutes because it's actually not a codes matter, it's a Broadcast Services Act matter. And that pleasingly is something that can be looked at over the next year or so as we work with the Department of Communications on a sustainability review that they're doing on community broadcasting. So it's ACMA's role to oversee compliance with the Act, licence conditions and the code. And we also have to write the codes in a way that ACMA can quite clearly regulate. So they need to be things that ACMA can say have been breached or not been breached. It's very important that we get that clarity right in putting this together. Gets rid of some of the grey areas that I often hear complaints about in the current codes. It's also important that we acknowledge that sector organisations like First Nations Media Australia, the NEMBC, Christian Media Arts Australia, RPHA and CBAA are here to provide support and advice around complying with these codes. And I think what's really important too is that we are, once we have the codes developed, and in some ways we've started already, we'll develop a whole lot of guidance material that will support the implementation of the codes. We'll work with various organisations, including the CMTO, to produce guidance material to make it easier for stations. Some of that guidance material is going to be resources. It might be a template, sponsorship template. It might be a different sort of template. There could be some short courses around learnings how to comply with the disinformation and misinformation clauses, for example. We're hoping to be able to translate the codes into different languages, just noting that ACMA regulates in English. All of our laws in this country are written in English, so it would always be the English version that is the one that ultimately ACMA is going to regulate against. We'll hopefully put together some videos and also some toolkits. One of the toolkits we're already working on is around complaints handling, because we know complaints handling is one of the key issues that this sector has, making sure that we promptly, transparently and carefully manage complaints that we get. We'd also welcome suggestions on what would be helpful. So when we get to the Q&A section, I really welcome anyone's suggestions on what might be helpful in terms of information or resources that could help you or stations understand and implement the code in a simple way as possible. So there's a few key areas of change, but in a lot of ways, they haven't changed as well. We've tried to streamline and simplify them. There is actually some more codes. We've split some codes. We've removed duplication with the legislation, as I mentioned earlier. But what's in the bottom of each of the codes, if you've had a look at the draft, is a little box that outlines other issues that are relevant. They might be legislative issues. They come from the Broadcast Services Act. They might be requirements from other legislation, whether that is if you're a charity through the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission, or through if you're an incorporated association and not a charity, the fair trading or relevant authority in your particular state or territory. We've tried to make them a little bit more flexible as well. So in the current code, station need to have specific policy documents in place that, for example, outline the principles of financial membership, the rights and responsibilities of financial members within the organisation, the rights and responsibility of the organisation to financial members. In the new draft codes, this has been simplified and broadened into an obligation to make publicly available key governance documents and annual reports, including annual financial statements. We're doing that because, for example, often things like obligations of financial members or those sorts of things might actually be across multiple documents. They might not be in a specific one. And also the constitution of your entity often outlines many of those sorts of things as well. So we're trying to make it more simple, but we're also trying to ensure that, for example, all organisations publish their annual reports and annual financial statements so that it is, community radio stations have a really clear obligation to stakeholders to be operating transparently and effectively. And it's really important those documents are published. And if you're a charity, if your organisation is a charity, you would already have to be doing that right now. We've worked with ACMA to give the stations as much flexibility as possible while still meeting ACMA's requirements for the codes to be accessible and enforceable. By enforceable, I mean what I said before. They need to be able to say, yes, a station has met this specific requirement, or no, they haven't. As much as possible, the new draft codes are not specific about what a station has to do or about exactly how they have to do it, but provides that broad guidance. The guidance material that I mentioned before will have examples, case studies, templates to actually help you meet that. I think I mentioned the old codes had some duplication with the Broadcast Services Act. That did create some confusions for ACMA and others, so we've clarified that. So, for instance, we've deleted the code about broadcasting no more than 5 minutes. That does not mean you can broadcast more than 5 minutes, just means it's not a code matter, the Broadcast Servicing Act matter. The other key changes is to align the codes with changes in what the community expects these days. So there's things in there like a new gambling code. What we've tried to do is keep it simple. For example, the commercial radio codes of practice, I think, have 5 or 6 pages alone on gambling. We've tried to sum it up in 1 or 2 sentences. That doesn't mean you can do all the things that commercial radio codes forbid. It's about we don't see it as a huge issue in this sector, but we don't like some specific feedback on that issue.
And we want it to be easy to understand.
Yeah. And of course, there's, the words misinformation and disinformation didn't exist in 2008, or if they did, we didn't know what they mean. That's now a really key issue for ACMA and for the community more broadly. So there's some, more information around misinformation and disinformation, and the obligation for stations to ensure that what is going to air is truthful and is meeting those requirements. And we've had a breach of the Act in recent weeks by a station around some of those matters. So it's really important that stations have a think about how they are ensuring they will meet these new codes, but even the current codes. We've also updated the code around to clarify things around hate speech and to prevent serious contempt of any person for protected attributes like age, disability, sexual orientation, race and culture. So they're the main changes. We're going to move pretty shortly to questions and answers, and I actually have parts of the codes that we can turn to if anyone's got specific questions. But ultimately, we're in a phase of consultation now. We have a draft out. We would like everyone to, as many people as possible, to provide comment on the codes until the 15th of December. You can do that in multiple ways. There's a QR code on the screen, which you should be able to use to go to the codes website. You can provide feedback either through a questionnaire. What other forms are there, Frida?
You can email us. It doesn't have to be a formal document that says like, dear such and such. As long as you put what your thoughts are into an email, that's fine. If you have accessibility needs or you just would prefer to do it by phone, you can also call us and we can take notes for you. We could help you fill out the survey online. Whatever help you need, we can help you with it if you call us or email us.
Thanks. So we're going to move to some questions. I can't see any yet. I can see one. Would there be a clear linkage between the guiding principles and the codes? It's an interesting question, Sue. I think, firstly, the guiding principles are not an enforceable part of the code, and they never have been. They are an agreed expectation of the sector on what people should do. We can certainly, we're looking at all feedback that comes through around how we can do that. What I will say is we're a broad church. Hang on, thank you, Sue, for the example. Sue has said, for example, just as the code section includes boxes for legislation, there could also be a box or some other shape, maybe a triangle, indicating which principles the code relates to, which could be one of them or more of the principles. That's a good point. I think we'll certainly have a look at how we may be able to cater for that. Thank you, Sue. Do we have any other questions? Things that people don't like, things that people support. Vivian has asked, will there be easy examples? Definitely. I think that is one of the really key things we've been discussing as part of the sector, but also with ACMA is, how do we provide examples? Not just, here's a template. We might, for example, we're working currently on a toolkit for complaints handling. It has template policy in it. It has sample letters or emails you can send to a person with a complaint, initially to acknowledge, to clarify questions, to do all those sorts of things. And we'll have in there some case studies, because what I always find, one of the things I find in the complaints handling example is stations often wait too long. Complaints are best dealt with quickly. As soon as you see a problem, often can be dealt with informally, because as soon as they've got to a formal stage, they're more serious. So I hope that answers your question, Vivian. Sue has asked, at 4.3, could not intentional be a qualifier here to remove the station's potential liability due to a rogue announcement? I'm just going to have a look at... I think the challenge, Sue, I think we can certainly look at all of these things, and, I'm not here today to say yes or no to anything. That's the point of a consultation. But what I will say is we can't change other legislation. There are, this is part of the privacy clause.
So I think Sue is suggesting we include not intentionally here in case somebody accidentally breaches the privacy clause.
We can certainly look at that, Sue. What I would say, though, is privacy legislation and defamation legislation doesn't always allow the non-intentional type of argument. So we'll certainly have a look at that and have a look at how that impacts on other laws. And
it'd be great if you could send it in your submission if you haven't already, so that we can make sure that it's covered, but I am making a note.
David Turrell has asked a question. In the guiding principles that mentioned celebrating languages and cultural diversity, did consideration be given to the word faith being included there? In the past, CMAA has been told that faith-based is not cultural. Good question, David. Certainly CMAA was involved in preparing this draft. We can certainly go back and have a look at that. And certainly the parts of the code have been very clearly drafted to ensure that faith, along with other protected attributes that are protected in human rights legislation or human rights treaties, is reflected. Someone just popped up a question saying they liked it, but Danny moved the question off my screen. So thank you for someone that liked the code so far. David, I hope that answered your question. Do we have any more questions? Thanks, David. Vivian has asked a question that I often get, and I think the team often get as well. We need clearer examples about what is allowed when interviewing businesses who might also happen to be sponsors, e.g. is this included in the 5-minute rule? At the moment, Vivian, I think we acknowledge the guidance isn't particularly clear. It's certainly an issue we've raised with ACMA, and I think it's the not-for-profit guidelines. ACMA's not-for-profit guidelines give some examples around that, but we will certainly be aiming to make that clearer as we go forward.
Is it one from Fiona in the chat?
Just put it on there. If anyone's sending some questions in the chat, can you do it through the Q&A section? It's just much easier for us to actually manage in that way. Jennifer, thanks for joining us today. Jennifer's question is, the problem with misinformation is some people feel the definition is open to interpretation. What's the experience with other stations? We have a lot of anti-vaxxers. I think that's a really good question, and there's been a few stations with anti-vaxxer problems. Look, I think it's the definition. Have you got the definition there?
Yes, we have rigorously reviewed it with the department word by word and the ACMA. So our wording, we can't kind of move on the wording too much because they're very specific about how they want it defined.
Yeah. So just Jennifer, and for everyone there, Code 5.1D has a definition of misinformation or disinformation. So it says misinformation is verifiable false, misleading or deceptive information that has the potential to cause serious harm to the community and or individuals, including disinformation, which is misinformation created or broadcast with malicious intent. I think there is always going to be some degree of subjectivity around some of these things. It's very important that stations boards realise that they are responsible. It's not the broadcaster that's broadcasting something on air, or the program maker or your DJ, whatever you want to call them. It's not them that is responsible. Ultimately, it's your board of directors or your committee of management. You need to make sure that they quite clearly have put in place policies and procedures, and that there are ways to keep an eye on these sorts of things and monitor them. Sue, you have a question about Code 8 Australian music content, but is it a broad question? I didn't quite understand the question. And also thanks for the note about a glossary. We have considered that, and in the end, we felt that including definitions within the document was probably easier than a glossary, but we can certainly relook at that as well.
Yes, perhaps in the guidance, well, definitely in the guidance materials to more in-depthly explain more problematic, more difficult terms and give case studies.
Thanks, Sue. We'll have a look at adding the word content into Code 8.
Oh, Australian music content.
Yeah. Vivian. So Vivian has asked, also when a business might give us tickets to give away, when, e.g., we mention the competition on air and name the winners, we need to know if it is included in the 5 minutes. These are not-for-profit businesses and they may be sponsors. I think your last answer to me is probably going to make it clearer. I have heaps of questions around these issues, which I will email to CBAA rather than taking every time. Thank you, Vivian. I think that's a great thing to do. Danny or any one of the team at CBAA will certainly be able to help you with that. I've got a question here. Hi, Frida. Hi, John. This sounds like a rigorous and beginning to transparent process with licence compliance. How functional could a reporting system be to address prolonged licence registration avoidance? I'm not actually quite sure what you mean by that question. I mean, ultimately, if you can provide a little bit more context, then I'd be very happy to answer that. David, Code 4.2, I'm just going to turn to that. David's asking, is it the cover freedom of speech? Just noticing that Australia does not have freedom of speech laws. We have freedom of communication laws, and we need to operate within those freedom of communication laws. So clause 4.2 does aim to ensure that we are that there is guidance around those freedom of communication laws. Sue has asked, there may need to be some clarifying narrative around 9.2. Sponsorship will not be a factor in deciding who can access broadcasting time. Certainly the guidance material can provide more on that. And I think what's often done is community radio stations often have policies around these sorts of things. And certainly I would suggest that in the information used, whether it's a sponsor's contract or those sorts of things, you have a very clear clause that ensures that it's made clear to sponsors that just because they give a sponsorship doesn't mean they'll get broadcasting time. I hope that answered your question, Sue. So I'm glad you've found reviewing the code a good process, and certainly some of the guidance material, we hope to be able to provide some checklists and those sorts of things as well. So you can do that. And I think it's a really, good thing for a board or a committee of management to go through regularly to ensure that everything is compliant. John Worcester has asked, why have my suggestions regarding Australian music content for fine music and ethnic broadcasters been ignored for 20 plus years? John, I think I'm not quite sure exactly what your question is, whether it's about increasing 10%
yes,
or...
wants to, sorry, I have had your, we have had your, and you would have been briefed about it, John, a little while ago, but we have responded as well to you, John, and this is really the place where you can contribute your letters. And I did send you an email. I didn't get an email back from you notifying you of the code consultation and saying that this was a good place where you can make your suggestions about additional, a greater quota for fine music and ethnic stations to have more Australian content, which I understand, and a lot of the stations in our sector do more Australian music content than the actual quotas. But I think the idea is to get a quota that represents what is possible for the whole sector, the whole ethnic and fine music sector. And absolutely, if that was the feeling of the whole ethnic and fine music sector, we would try to reflect that in the code. Is that right, John?
Yeah. So sure, John, send through those suggestions, but ultimately, it's a decision of the majority of the sector on which direction to go. And you've got a couple of questions there. I'll do them together. What's the view on promoting ticketed shows, gigs on air and mentioning the cost of tickets? Look, I think it's probably a topic of another webinar, Ange. It is a tricky area, and I think one of the things we hope to do with the guidance material is make that clearer.
A lot of people have had a question around this.
Yeah, so we'll take that on board, look at how we can make that clearer in either the guidance material as part of the codes. And there's a clarity to that earlier question to clarify that broadcast of songs with licensing areas, could a reporting system that is available to everyone address the issue if licensing irregularities are a culture? I'm actually still not quite sure what that, unfortunately, I'm not quite sure what that question refers to. Keep the questions coming, everyone. I think David Turrell has asked the question, what is the difference between sale of airtime to charities and community groups and sponsorship? No, it's not covered in the codes, David. Certainly look at how we can clarify that. Just bearing in mind that, the definition of sponsorship in the Broadcast Services Act doesn't differentiate between the way a particular entity is registered, whether it's a proprietary limited company, a not-for-profit company, a social enterprise, a charity, or anything else. So that is a difficulty with the Act that is certainly worth having a look at over this next phase that I mentioned earlier, because the Department of Communication, which is not their full name, will be looking at reviewing the sustainability of community, how they can support sustainable community broadcasting, including through changes to the Broadcast Services Act. Danny, can you scroll down? Maybe I need to scroll down a little bit. There we go. So our brand costing licence responds directly to broadcast community, perhaps rather than artists. Look, copyright is a complex matter. All stations will have an APRA-AMCOS licence and a PPCA licence. The money that they pay to PPCA and APRA-AMCOS is distributed to artists along with everyone else or others involved in the broadcast chain, from songwriters to recording labels and all of those sorts of things. Of course, you know, there is an ability to deal directly with artists and all of those people directly, but I think that's pretty much an impossibility. It's an impossibility for big broadcasters. It's going to be an impossibility for community broadcasters as well. And APRA-AMCOS and PPCA are then responsible for distributing those funds that we pay as community broadcasters to them, to those artists and other people in the music industry. John's asked a follow-up question. Fine Music Melbourne was somewhat conservative and ethnic stations much more so, and the label would never agree to an increase of 10%. That may be the case, John, and that's the purpose of this consultation, to canvass a whole wide variety of views. What's the time?
3:32.
So we've got a few more minutes if there's any more questions coming through. I'm very happy, Frida and I'd be very happy to answer them. And if there's no more to come through, I'll give you another few minutes. We can always wrap up early.
I'll just jump in quickly and say to Vivian and Ange, your question there about giveaways and such, I'll be able to send you both some information from the ACMA Community Broadcasting Sponsorship Guidelines shortly after the end of this session.
Thanks, Danny. So we might, if there's no more questions coming through, we might call an end to this webinar. Thank you to everyone for attending. We'll send out a survey shortly so we can get some feedback on the session and how Frida and I have gone. Please, and if you have any questions after this, please don't hesitate to send them through to us. The consultation details should still be on the screen. So you have another week or so. I think the 15th of December is next week. What happens next, just to let everyone know, is once we have the feedback on the 15th of December over the sort of Christmas, January period, we'll be reviewing that feedback. We'll be looking at what issues have been raised, where there might be gaps, where people or organisations might have some problems, and then we'll decide on the way forward. If there's high levels of support, it may be that it doesn't change at all. If there's lots of queries and suggestions, that it may change significantly. So, you know, we'll have definitely have some guidelines, feedback to you probably in early February around how that can happen. We've got one last question, I think, here from Vivian. I'm hoping to have something produced by CBAA that can be given to our brand to say, asking for more clarification around sponsorship rules, etc. As Danny just mentioned, he'll send some things through right now.
And we are talking about making this document guidance some more, because there is the ACMA sponsorship guidelines, but they're a little bit difficult to follow. So we are talking about whether there's a need to do this, an easy to follow page that you can add to your presenters.
Great. So thank you, everyone. Our next webinar is next Tuesday, 13th of December. It's covering how to promote online safety for young people at your station, a very important topic, and being presented by the E-Safety Commission. Otherwise, have a safe summer break, and we certainly look forward to seeing you all next year and giving you another update on the new codes of practice and how we're progressing. Thank you all.